Hello everyone. I did a poll recently on my community tab asking what sort of content you guys wanted to see from me in August while I'm working on my big discourse video, and you voted for a Fire Emblem tier list. I have done a few tier lists on this channel before, but never one for Fire Emblem. I did ask for suggestions if you guys had anything specifically you wanted me to talk about, and I got a few good ones, and I ended up going with one that you probably already noticed either by the title of this video or this indicator down here. I'm going to be talking today about Fire Emblem's archetypes. And I chose this one because I thought that it would be something interesting for generating conversation as I rank these concepts, because archetypes are not set in stone the way that some people tend to think of them. They are a combination of intelligent systems, first of all, recycling character concepts from game to game, which is understandable. There's over 1,000 named characters in this series, and they're in very similar settings, so of course there's going to be repeats. And then from the player end, archetypes are predominantly pattern recognition. There's no official idea of which archetypes there are, who belongs to which, etc. I'm pretty sure that the one or both of the fan wikis have lists of archetypes that they've compiled, but for that you do have to remember that fan wikis are created by fans and therefore have a degree of subjectivity to them as well. So I didn't go off of that for which archetypes I'm going to be talking about today. Instead, I went through this list on the quite literally every Fire Emblem character tier list that I found. Quite amusing if you see how many characters there are here. I went through and I found 20 archetypes that I believe are broadly representative of the idea. Some are gameplay based, some are more story and character based, and I think it's a good mixture because the archetypes do, they cover both aspects of Fire Emblem, and I wanted to represent that. And I'm going to be ranking them, or sort of ordering them based on how interesting and or useful I think they are. So, if they have the potential to be varied and interesting, they'll be in the uppermost category. If they're just useful but not terribly varied, they'll be down here. The ones that I'm just sort of indifferent to and don't really have much to say about, sure, why not? And then just stop for the ones that I wish that intelligence systems would stop making. Just, we don't need more characters like this, either because they weren't that good of an idea to begin with, or they're no longer relevant in modern Fire Emblem because of shifts in how gameplay works and things like that. So, like I said, I have 20 here based on the character that they're usually named after, or the earliest example that I could think of. In many cases, they're the same thing, but just to be clear who's on here. And as I go through them, I'll be naming other examples to, sort of, in case you're not as familiar with all of these games, just I can, name more recent ones. So let's start with almost certainly the most well-known archetype. It's, as far as I know, the only one that's been referenced in official media. I'm thinking specifically of the Binding Blade TV ad where there's a Japanese opera, and some of the lyrics are to the effect of "Don't overuse your Jagen character, or you won't have enough experience for your other units later." But anyway, yes, it's the Jagen, the overpowered pre-promote that you get at the start of most games. So this would be Jagen himself, this is Oife, this is Marcus in both of the Olevian games, this is Seth, of course, Titanian, FE9, Soth probably in Radiant Dawn. There's a couple that could qualify there. And then in the modern era, Frederick, Gunter, Vander. I do believe that Jagens are useful in terms of teaching you elements of how to play the game, because you learn about experience acquisition and allocation. You learn about how how to train up your units if you're using them to weaken enemies so that your weaker units can get the kills. They're usually helpful for mobility since most of them are mounted. There's only a few exceptions, like Abel from Thracia. Or they'll be deliberately overpowered, so they kind of teach you to not overextend that because you may find them more useful later. And of course, some Jagens do go way overboard, like Seth and FE9 Titania, where you can just solo the game with them. But that's not ideal usually. I feel like I'm not going to give them too much credit for that because that's less of a something that's interesting about them and more of just it's a challenge run concept. And I feel like outside of that, there hasn't been that much variance in the Jagen concept. And most of them tend not to be fairly interesting as characters either. There are exceptions, Titania is another one there. But generally, they're the older mentor figures, and they haven't had that much variation. Like, I think the biggest shift is that starting with Tellius and then working our way forward, they switched from being primary lance users to primary axe users, and that's about the biggest shift that any of the archetype has ever seen, which isn't all that interesting. It's just a weapon type. But I guess that's why Vander is an axe paladin in the most recent game. So I'm going to put them in have their uses because they've got gameplay uses, but they're not super thrilling as a concept. And of course, everyone does know them, so that's good. Sort of in the opposite, we now move on to the Est category. Est units are units who join late at a low level, but they tend to have really good potential if you train them up. So they are, in a sense, the opposite of the Jagen. I've never been particularly interested in the S characters. Usually they're just too much, they're more trouble than they're worth to train up, and I've never really been drawn to most of them as characters, and they don't really have a lot in common as characters, except that as units they tend to be squishy classes like Pegasus Knights and Mages. But that's not something that really speaks to me as a group. And like I said, they are a lot of work to get up there. Like the biggest one that I can think of, because she was much debated over back when the game was current, was FE7's Nino. And I know a lot of people love to swear by her and just how good she could be if you put in the work for her. But I was always of the opinion that why would I bother training Nino when Pent is better out the gate and requires zero effort, and if you've been working on Urk and or Lucius earlier in the game, then they're perfectly serviceable and there's no real need to bother with Nino. So yes, Nino Est herself in several games. I would maybe Tormod in FE9. He's the last unpromoted you get. Also, maybe someone like Miranda and Thracia. I'm like, she's awful though. That's an extreme example. I would probably say the most recent example. That's the other thing, is that Ests have not been that common in the more recent Fire Emblems, in large part because I think with Three Houses and Engage specifically, all the characters you get are on a level curve, so that there's no real standouts like you would see with the S units. The closest in Engage would be like Hortensia, but Hortensia, you can promote her immediately, and she's a great flying staff bot with no effort required. So I wouldn't even really count her. I'm putting them, the S category, down here in sure, why not? Um, Moving along to, we have Kane here, but he's part of a duo he's representing the Christmas Knights, the red and the green. I do have Sane further down here, but he's representing a different archetype, so we're just mentioning Kane and Abel and all of their successors. I think there's been a lot of room to build on the concept of the Christmas Knights. I mean, they're very basic. They're just one's red, one's green. Usually one is laid back and one is more uptight. And then in the older games, one would favor swords while the other favors lances. But they've done more interesting things with them, especially in the Awakening era onward. Like in Awakening, one of them is a woman. In Fates, they're brothers and ninjas. In Echoes, Lucas and Forsyth were kind of retooled into the Christmas Knight dynamic alongside a third blue character, Python, and they have a very funny rapport between the three of them. And then neither Three Houses nor Engage has the traditional knight setup, but they do have, like, I think Catherine and Shamir do have the red and green coloring, depending on how you reclass them, and more obviously, Engage has Clan and Fram. So I would have to say that there's a lot of room for creativity, despite their identifying traits being one's red and one's green. They weren't as creative in the older Fire Emblems, but they really stepped it up since then. So moving on to early game Pegasus Knights. I had two ideas for Pegasus Knight archetypes. One was going to be Pegasus Knight Sisters, because there are quite a few sets of those, but I decided not to go with that one because we haven't had any other sibling Pegasus Knight sets since Sacred Stones, which was quite a while ago. I believe that IS has sort of realized that their main draw there are the White Wings, and that they haven't really been able to successfully replicate the success of the original Pegasus Sister trio, so they haven't tried. But the early game Pegasus Knight, here represented by Sita, and that would also include Florina, Vanessa, Marcia. If we're expanding to early game Flyer, Jill and Radiant Dawn, Sumia, Subaki, Chloe and Engage. Just, I think they're useful, kind of like the Jagens. They're useful as a gameplay tool because they teach you about, well, flyers as a concept, that they're high mobility, but they're very squishy and they don't tend to hit very hard, but they have a lot of utility, especially in games where they can do things like rescue dropping and things like that. So while they're not the most varied out there, I do like that early game Pegasus Knights exist. That's one of the things you tend to miss in, or I tend to miss in Three Houses, because unless you're um, unless you're playing as the Blue Lions, you don't get a quote unquote canon Pegasus Knight, which is somewhat interesting. But then again, that's another reason why the Lions are often cited as the most traditional set of units of the three options that you have. So yes, they're useful, not super varied, but they're there. Continuing on with Marth's early game party, because Marth did set a lot of standards going forward. Early game archers. They tend to be really bad, which is kind of sad but true. It's almost a part of the archetype. So Gordon, but also both of the archers in Thracia, Walt, Will, and Rebecca for that matter, Naomi, Rolf in FE9, Leonardo in Radiant Dawn, Virion. They're less common. They've been less common recently, although Ash is a pretty low tier character in Three Houses, and he's an early game archer, and I believe the Engage gameplay discussion is still going back and forth on whether Etier is actually good or not. So they do kind of have legs, but the problem is that while they do teach you about indirect combat early on, I don't like they're very, very hard to make into good units, and they don't tend to be very interesting either, like a lot of the starting parties in the older Fire Emblems. So I feel like we should just move beyond this and make it so that archers are not terrible as, like, I'm not the biggest fan of archers, but they can, I would prefer if units were not specifically being highlighted because these are bad unit types and don't use them, until you, outside of certain niches, or in the games where they have things like where they can counter at one range or something like that, or longbows are super useful. But that's game dependent. So yeah, we could do without some, like, such a deliberately weak archetype. Um, that there's a reason that pre-promoted snipers who join mid-game tend to be better than the characters like these. In a similar vein, we have the early game armor. which is also an archetype known for being bad, but also kind of so bad that sometimes they become a meme. Like that happens with Arden in Genealogy, and that happens really hard with Kellum in Awakening, where they're barely even present, and that's the joke, sort of. And it's a really ineffective way to teach players about tanking or the usefulness of heavy armor options because you're never gonna get them anywhere because they're so slow. Like I will say that Engage did this fairly well by making the movement differences between unit types less extreme and making armors immune to the break mechanic, so they actually do have a niche. And it's not that hard to use Louis in early game and get some good use out of him, even if he's not really that great long term from everything that I've seen. And I could not go through this section without at least mentioning Dedue, because Dedue takes the generally bland and forgettable archetype that includes such hits as Kellum and Bors, who is as boring as the name might suggest. Dedue takes that and just runs with the idea of the early game armor, and by making him into a supporting character, he is so much more interesting, and he's one of my favorites from Three Houses. This is not going to be the last time that I mention something like that, but I do think that that alone, that plus Engage actually making armors sort of useful elevates them above the bad early game archer archetype for me. Now we have villager units. I have gray here representing because Gaiden/Echoes has a ton of these. Um, and this would also count the trainee units in FE8. This would be Donnell, Mozu, probably Cyril in Three Houses, and Jean in Engage. These are kind of like S units, but they come early enough to where you can train them, with the exception of like Ewan and Amelia and Sacred Stones, but they're really more like S, and they're not that great as a result. I like these a bit better because there is a lot of customization with many of them. The villagers from Gaiden were the earliest instances of branched promotions in the series, so that's always very interesting. And like I said, particularly because a lot of them have aptitude to boost their growths, they can be very fun to use. To borrow a term from another FE tuber, Professor Bopper, he came up with the idea of unit feel, which is not necessarily how good a unit is, but how fun they are to use. And I think the villager units can be very fun in that regard because of just what you can do with them, which is kind of ironic because I don't tend to like games where you have the free for all reclassing, or I think that can be a drawback. But I think when you limit it more, like with the villagers or the trainees, it feels more interesting than if everybody can do that. So I'm going to put them up in have their uses because they are varied, they make good units, and they do kind of fulfill that story niche of like these really weak civilian characters who, pick up a weapon for the first time and slowly grow into it, that kind of thing, which is interesting to see in some cases. Okay, so next up we have another duo. It's not very obvious. I have Lena here, but I'm mostly listing her here as a pair with early game thieves because there was a thing, particularly in older pre-awakening Fire Emblem, where the first cleric you get, or one of them, would be paired with a thief. So Lena and Julian, um, Idun and Dew in Genealogy, um, Safi and Lithis in Thracia, um, Matthew and Sarah sort of in FE7, and then I think it reached its most prominent example with Micaiah and Soth in Radiant Dawn, and then you have a callback to that relationship in Engage with Emblem Micaiah going to a thief, Yunaka. It's an interesting idea, I think, not that it keeps being reused. It's one of the more unusual ones, I think, that they keep coming back to this because there's no logical reason why you would pair a cleric and a thief except that they're loosely utility units. I'm gonna put it under sure why not, because it it's the most unusual thing about it is that it keeps showing up. On its own, I don't know. I don't really see much use for it, but yeah. The Navarre archetype. This is another fairly known one. It's basically edgy swordsman. So Navarre himself, of course. Basically, the entire royal family of Isaac in genealogy. Although there is one sidebar to that I'm going to talk about later because you can see Aira here. Thracia, I think, has one or two of them, like Shiva, I believe. I haven't played Thracia in a while. Rutger, Guy, Joshua. Oh, I should mention that Joshua and Natasha are a variation on the cleric and thief thing, where Joshua is a myrmidon rather than a thief, but they have a similar dynamic and they come together. Probably, I don't know about Zhark. He's not very edgy. Longhu in Awakening definitely is, and Felix, of course, is the nod to it in Three Houses. I've never been a fan of these as characters, and a lot of it does seem to rely on that they're interesting characters, and I've never really felt it. Sorry. Like, this is kind of how I feel about Felix when I talk about him, because I've mentioned Felix a lot, and specifically his relationship to Dimitri in various videos. And while I enjoy it in theory, it's not something I get invested in terms of shipping, in large part because I just don't really like that whole prickly, edgy personality that Felix has. The other thing is that a lot of people like Myrmidons because they're high crit units, and I'm not really sold on them for that reason, but I'm not going to be too harsh on them. They do have uses in some games as boss killers, particularly Binding Blade. They're well known for that. But because that's pretty limited by the game, I'm just going to put them in sure, why not. Next we have the gota unit. Gotas are very late joining units who are basically pre-made. They are RNG proof. You can't screw them up in any way short of just getting them killed off. They're another one that tends to have been more common earlier in the series and have sort of fallen off since then, in large part because of gameplay shifts. So you have the original Gota, Mycen and Guided Echoes. Thracia has several, like Sed, Sias, Galzus. Who else? Corel in Binding Blade, Athos in FE7. Who else? The Lagus Royals in FE9, and all the characters who join you in the tower in FE10, because there's like 6 or 8 of them, although Laron is the most Gota of them because he's only available for the very last part. And he is more like Gota himself, where he's just a really powerful mage. But since Radiant Dawn and outside of remakes, there's only one example I can really think of, and I really don't like him for gameplay reasons. Also as a character, but I don't like him for gameplay reasons. And if you watched my Three Houses tier list video, you know who I'm talking about. Yuritsa is really not designed for the 100% idea, but he's also not designed for Three Houses' whole game design ethos, which is that you can build units however you like. He is by far the most pre-made unit in Three Houses, and it really just doesn't work with the philosophy of that game, and it's so frustrating. And even though he is a very early joining unit by Gota standards, he's got like a whole 6 chapters, that's not enough to, build him in any sort of different way if you want to. Like, even if you want to go with his budding talent for flying and make him a Wyvern Lord, because you make everyone a Wyvern Lord at Three Houses, it's probably going to be more effort than it's worth, and you can just better off just keeping him as a Death Knight. So I feel like this one has probably outlived its use, because it in games where you have a lot more customizable options for units, having such a strictly pre-made one just doesn't work as well. And if they're going to keep going in that direction, I would probably prefer that they just stopped giving you units after a certain point, which I do notice that they have done, like Fates, Three Houses again, Engage, they all, like, you get your last unit like a good 5 or so chapters before the end of the game. You don't get anybody right at the end. So there's less of that problem outside of what I mentioned about 100% completion. So yeah, they can just stop with these. Now we're moving on for a bit. The next ones, the ones I have now are all villain archetypes, so they're less about gameplay and more about story. But I wanted to include these because we have quite a few. The Red Emperor. This is probably the most common villain archetype. We got the original Rudolph here. This is Harden in March 2nd games. We've got Arvis, of course, the original Flame Emperor. Raedric and Zephiel are purple emperors, but I still think they qualify. So is Vigard, if you want to count him, zombie Vigard. Ashnard, of course. Valhart goes back to the red coloring. I guess Garen too, even though he's a slime monster. And Engage teases at it, and of course, I can't help but mention Edelgard, so Red Emperors. I think they're good as a villain archetype, particularly because they tend to handle the more political side of the conflicts that you see in Fire Emblem, and they serve that purpose well. They frequently work alongside the more fantastical supernatural one, which we're going to talk about in a second. And I think there are creative uses for them, so I'm going to put the Red Emperor up here because, Rudolph himself is a sort of Greek tragedy twist with only discovering that Rudolph is his father after he's killed him. There's Arvis as well-intentioned extremist. There's the whole Zephiel is kind of went very fatalistic after his various family tragedies. Ashnard is a social Darwinist. Edelgard is what if the Red Emperor was a waifu, which has issues, but I've talked about those. Valhart is that, but also kind of Ashnard, but also you can sleep with him as an undead revenant. Okay, Valhart is pretty bad. You can maybe sort in Ryoma here. He at least has the coloring and on Conquest he has that role, although I don't know if I would call him. But then again, Conquest does interesting things with Ryoma. If it were a little less, if it leaned a little more into his moral grayness, I would like that. But that just goes to show that the Red Emperor is a very flexible archetype. So I would definitely say it's got room to be creative. The second, I guess, what you call the other side of Fire Emblem's main villains is the Garnaf. These are the evil sorcerers. They tend to be the more, like I said, the supernatural or the fantastical enemies. So Garnaf, Jeddah, Manfroy, he's the big one. Not Veld, he's terrible. Nurgle, Leon would be here. Izuka, kind of, but he's more of a minor antagonist. Valadar, Iago wishes he was this. And then there's my favorite, and the one who elevates the Garnaf above and beyond. Normally I would have put him down like, sure, why not, because they tend to be pretty boring, but Three Houses gave us Hubert, and I love Hubert. He is delightfully hammy villain all the way, and you know what? Props to IS and or Koei Tecmo for just making that into a playable character. He's an unapologetic patricidal murderer, and I just love how evil he gets to be, and that he actually gets away with being evil in certain routes. I mean, I can't really think of any other characters that get away with willing voluntary patricide in Fire Emblem, or just kinslaying in general, without either some kind of comeuppance or at least just a whole bunch of trauma. and Hubert just does not care at all, and I adore him for it. So he gets elevated to has their uses, both the garnaf both as a plot device and just because they can be fun. Like the more I think about it, Hubert is he's not just a garnaf, he's also like a fusion of that with the quirky dark mage that Awakening and Fates did with Henry and Odin. But as I believe one of my blog mutuals once said, Hubert is like Odin if he actually was as dark and as evil as he claimed to be, and he wasn't just saying that for the sake of melodrama. And that makes Hubert very entertaining for me. But anyway, we're moving on from the Garnaf. Next villain archetype, the Camus. There have been a lot of Camus over the years, and I do not know how to make Camus plural in a way that would make sense in English, so I'm not going to bother. The classic Camus is like him, Eldigan, Percival, who's recruitable. Who else? Petrin fits under there for Radiant Dawn. There's, I would probably say Zelgius is definitely there. You can argue several characters from Three Houses depending on which route you're playing. Like I really don't like the idea of Yuritsa as a Camus, but he's kind of the closest thing to one in a lot of the routes. And I can't really think. Engaged. Okay, let me backtrack a bit. I will say that there is a variant of Camus that I do not like, and it's particularly because it's always done with female characters, starting with Ishtar from Genealogy and moving on to things like Brunya, Selena, that one Valkyrie from Awakening, whose name I can't remember, and most recently Zethia in Engage. And I don't care for that because the Camus is a tragic figure, usually because of his loyalty to his country. He might have other things going on, like loyalty to a particular character, like Zelgius has with Laurent. But with the female variations, with very few exceptions, like Petrin, it's always framed as there's a romantic attachment to the villain, which is just, yeah, why do they gotta keep going there? Like they even did it with Zephy, and she's not even really attracted to Sombron. She just wants a baby with him, and everybody rags on that because, yeah, it's a terrible writing choice. And it just reflects how IS is just consistently not good with writing female characters. And this is really rampant in Heroes, especially in the current book. There are like 3 characters that are almost written to be exactly the same. They're lonely and they want to be with the summoner or some other man, so that's what makes them villainous. And it's just, ugh. I feel like that drags down the entire Camus archetype. They have room to be creative. There are some good ones, but ooh, there are some bad ones. But overall, it is a good concept that you should have sympathetic villains who are not the main villain. And some of these are recruitable, so that does show the flexibility of them. But like I said, some of them are really bad. Moving on, this is our last purely villainous archetype, the Bara bandits. I'm not entirely sure which one this is because there's a pair of these in both Eledian games. And then they also show up in Radiant Dawn as Tiger Lagus. Their most prominent one is in Awakening, Victor and Vincent, where they show up in multiple chapters. There's the pair in Fates that you can recruit by capturing them as bosses. And then they most recently showed up in Engage in the chapter where you get Tamara. But they're a lot more toned down. The Bara Bandits are memorable because their whole joke is basically that they're these big buff muscle men who are really effeminate. And like some of them even have women's names for no apparent reason. Like the first 2 in FE6, they're named Maggie and Rose. And yeah, the whole thing feels pretty obviously homophobic because the quote-unquote joke is that they're big buff guys who are effeminate, and that's not funny. That's just the character type. But they do come up distressingly often, and I'm getting the impression that in Engage they might have realized that while they can be campy fun, it's not really that great because in Engage they're really toned down, especially if you compare it to like Victor and Vincent in Awakening, who are pretty much in love with each other despite also being brothers. I kind of prefer they just scrap this idea because it's like it's it's it makes for some goofy, memorable chapters with where they would otherwise just be one-off bosses, but yeah, it's kind of homophobic as well. Not a fan of that. Okay, moving on to slightly more unsettling things. We have the underage dragon girl, represented by Tiki, and while this isn't the most common one in the world, there are still around half a dozen of them. We have, of course, Faye and Myrrh from the GBA era. There's the infamous Noe and her daughter in Awakening. Sothis was kind of hit some of those same buttons, even though she never transforms. I might even say Flame does too. So there's been some in the modern era, and I know that there's a market for characters like this. I'm obviously not the market, and I do get the impression from how much IS pushes Tiki specifically in Heroes that they may be understanding that that is their biggest cash cow in terms of underage dragon girls. So they just really push her a lot, and I know a lot of people are frustrated with that, but I guess Japan really likes Tiki. I kind of wish they would stop with the underage dragon girl spam. Like even if you accept the hand wave that they're hundreds of years old, so it's totally okay to be into them. It's just not that interesting. Like I kind of wish we had more varied shapeshifters. Like, give us more adult shapeshifters. Give us an underage male shapeshifter if you really have to. Just something different, because it seems like uh, there's so like the outside of Tellius, Fire Emblem really doesn't explore much in the way of like the many possibilities they could have for these shape-shifting demi-humans that exist in these stories. So why do we always have to come back to the little girls? Anyway, well, the next one's even more uncomfortable, possibly. Lachesis, the character who is most well known for wanting to sleep with her brother. And this has come up over and over again. It's always teenage girls who crush on their older brothers. There's Clarine, Priscilla. There's some people say Myth displacing that feeling onto Boyd because Boyd physically resembles Ike. But then they brought it back more obviously with Claire and Echoes, who got rewritten to be a Lachesis archetype. And in the Japanese version of Fates, there's a gender flipped version with Leo crushing on Camilla. At least I've read that the Leo is much more obviously into his sister in the Japanese version. And I can maybe even see this with the controversy over Nell in the DLC of Engage, with her being explicitly in love with her um, brother or sister Alir. That being a thing. I I feel like this is. I don't want to completely dismiss it like I do with the Underage Dragons, because there have been some interesting things that have been done with this. Like, I think Lachesis herself is a very tragic figure, and her character does go in a variety of different directions, only some of which have to do with her feelings for Eldigan. But I think, like, there are ways to deal with the subject of, um, sibling incest in ways that aren't just, ew, it's gross, we shouldn't, this needs to be condemned at all times, or, let's just go horny for this. Like, it's, you know, this is one of the reasons why Yggdrasil gets compared to Game of Thrones a lot, because they have that element in common, and I think you can do things with this. It's not, like, there are really flat ones, like, um, the the Nell thing doesn't really go anywhere. I don't think Clarine has much either, but Priscilla is interesting, at least in terms of, is it just her being an immature girl, or does she actually really want Raven to carry through on the marriage proposal thing? I'm gonna put this one in sure, why not? I've praised Fire Emblem for being campy and tasteless in the past, and I feel like I can't outright condemn this because the Lachesis archetype is just a prime example of Fire Emblem being tasteless and just running with it. So it's there. What's less commendable is why Aira is here, because I have her as the exotic swordswoman archetype, which is it's not all female myrmidons fall into this. There are some like Mia and Lapis that I would say are just kind of there. But the exoticized swordswoman is, well, she's got to be a myrmidon or equivalent, and she always comes from some sort of ethnically othered culture, like, so Aira herself, Marita, Lynn, probably Marissa in Sacred Stones, or Fur and Carla in the Leaving games. And then much more obviously in the modern era, starting with Athena in the Shadow Dragon remake, and then Sayri and Petra, and arguably Kagetsu as a gender flipped version. And I say that this is becoming uncomfortable because, especially with the modern era ones, because starting with Athena, they all have some kind of accent or noticeable speech pattern, and it just feels like they're being exoticized just to make that into a character trait. Petra in particular has a lot of the whole nubile savage thing in her post time skip look, which is just uncomfortable. And then you get to like Sayri, which is Sayri and her brother seem to be sort of pastiches of fantasy China. And then Athena, I don't even know what Athena's accent is supposed to be. Kagetsu, it seems to be a little more toned down, but he still stands out because he's like inexplicably Japanese in a setting that otherwise just doesn't have a Japan. Um, but of course, being male, he never gets sexualized in the same way that someone like Petra would. So I would prefer that they just stop with this one because it's better in the games like the Yu-Gi-Oh games and Leaving games where you have multiple characters from that one setting, but that tends to be not the case anymore with like Petra from Brigid or Sayri, with the exception of her brother from an alternate continuity, and Kagetsu again. There, because there's only one character, they feel even more exotic, and they feel like that's the only reason that they're there. So maybe lay off that a bit, please. Okay, three left. So, Sane. This is the womanizer character. There were ones before Sane, I think, that were like that, like Homeros and Thracia, but here I'm talking about characters who make that like a recurring gag with them. So, Sane, Gatry, Sylvain, Louis, although I've heard he's more obvious in the Japanese version, that he's more clearly voyeuristic rather than just people watching. Um, oh, and Virion and Inigo Awakening doubles up on these. Um, I think they have their uses, but they're also kind of uncomfortable as a recurring concept, especially when you get to things um, like Soleil tries to be a female version of it, but many people have talked at length about why a lot of things Soleil does are uncomfortable, and it just putting that personality into a female character doesn't make it okay with some of the things she does, but particularly with Ophelia. I'm putting it in sure, why not? Because Fire Emblem's always had dating sim aspects, at least since the Yu-Gi-Oh games, so it's not surprising we would have characters like this, and there are some female equivalents where they're primarily looking for, female characters looking for men, like Charlotte. I'm not counting those would be more of a separate thing, but yeah, I'm pretty indifferent, in particular because with the botched exception of Soleil, these are all very heterosexual, and I just don't have a lot of interest in that. So, speaking of things that are not so heterosexual, we move on to the very feminine male characters, starting with Lucius and moving into ones like Libra, Forest, and then most recently Rosado. And this isn't just that they have long hair, it's that they are remarked on in canon as being very feminine. And while I do think that can be uncomfortable, like Libra, like the way that Libra is talked about and how, like, even from his recruitment conversation, he has to affirm that he's a guy, that's pretty bad. But on the flip side, you get, you know, somewhat interesting explorations of male gender nonconformity with both Forrest and Rosato, and I like those. I know some people wish that they'd gone further and made them trans characters, but honestly, I don't trust IS to write a good trans character, especially with the way that all of these, even recent games, still have gender locked classes, so they would be addressing that. And there's the whole cultural divide that we see when we talk about Kiza and how Japan doesn't quite view trans identity the same way, so that would have to be translated. So I'm fine with them at least having gender non-conforming characters. It'd be interesting to maybe have like a female version of that, like a a female character who's not just a tomboy but is actively gender non-conforming in the same way that say Rosato is. But we can wait, and I'd see that as maybe being less likely considering how how much IS values their waifus. So I will say have their uses. Libra's bad. The other three, even Lucius has like I like that his relationship with Raven is treated like pretty seriously. Like Raven never really remarks on Lucius's appearance. He basically just says that Lucius is like his wife, and they just go with it. And you know what? I like that. Um, so I really think I'm not giving the ones that are room to be creative. I feel like I need to elevate some of these because I'm just now realizing that I'm being too harsh on these. Um, like, um, you know what? Just because of Hubert alone, you're going up here. I know I'm changing, and I'm gonna move Drog up here for the sake of Dedu because, yeah, we got give credit where credit is due. Some, the more interesting ones, because that's certainly not the case with the last one that I have. Tharia is here standing in as the obsessed avatar character, the character who's written entirely around being in love with or being fixated on the avatar. Obviously, they can't. This needs to have the avatar to even exist at all. But if you've watched any of my videos, you know I don't like avatars in general. But I just do not like these characters because of how much they drag down the writing. Like I'm talking about Tharia, Rajat, obviously, arguably Camilla in Fates as well. Ivy is the newest one in Engage. I didn't quite click with me until I saw the summer banner in July, and people pointed out that that's the reason she and Tharia are on the same banner. I'm like, oh, I get it. She's into the Avatar. Um, and most controversially, Edelgard. And I don't like these. I mean, there's the obvious reason that all of them are female characters, and I'm just not into that. And the Avatar is supposed to be your self-insert, so I just don't like that I'm expected to have like this character crushing on me. But like Edelgard is a prime example of how much this characterization drags down otherwise good potential because everything has to be written around being appealing to the self-insert. And I also just don't like the double standards that people have with these where they're bad if they're like Camilla or Tharia where they have cleavage, but if they don't have cleavage, they're okay. Yeah, you don't need to have them in a skimpy outfit to be player pandering. And you can see both varieties fully at work in Heroes. Heroes has a ton of female characters who are written this way to be so into the summoner. I mean, the most recent one, the one that everyone was talking about back in the spring, is the one in book 7 where she actually says she wants to make a baby with the summoner. I'm like, oh my god, please stop. Just stop, please. It would be somewhat interesting to see them try to write a male character that way, The closest thing I can think of to a male character who is actually on that same level would be Soren, because of how much he's into Ike, to the point where people who like bash Ike Soren as a pairing will say that Soren is obsessed with Ike. And while I can kind of see that Ike is not an avatar, and he doesn't work quite as well as a self-insert because of that. He's more of a distinct character on his own. He has a distinct personality. So I wouldn't call Soren an example of this. He might be the closest, though. I don't know if they would ever write a male character to actually be obsessed with an avatar to this degree, because it would require them expressing that even towards the male avatar, which, contrary to what some people say about Dimitri and Azure Moon, no, they've never actually gone there. It's just, I know why it exists, but I really don't like this archetype, so that's where it goes. Well, anyway, that looks like I am finished with the 20 that I picked out. I was a bit harsher than I thought I would. I mean, I went back and reevaluated some, but yeah, archetypes are definitely interesting to discuss because they're they are so subjective, but because a lot of it is that pattern recognition, people are still going to be making these connections and having opinions on these recurring concepts. So, yeah, let me know down in the comments how you feel about these various archetypes, or if there's a big one that you think that I missed and what you think about it, and maybe you want me to comment on how I feel about it. I don't know if I'll get to all of them, but I will try depending on how many comments I get. And, the usual like and subscribe and all that. And if you are just now joining this channel, subscribing now would be great, because I am about halfway through with working on a very long project on Fire Emblem Discourse. So there's going to be a lot of fun drama that I'm going to be talking about. That's going to be coming out in early September. It's progressing quite well. And I would like to thank everyone for listening in and watching, and thanks to the people who voted in the poll and to the commenter who suggested this idea. I had fun making this. But yeah, so I will see you guys later, and I hope you guys, subscribe and tune in for that discourse video. It's going to be a lot of fun. Au revoir.